February 13th, 2026. EPA Administrator Lee Zeldin steps up to a podium beside President Trump and announces that the federal government is officially killing the start-stop system. He calls it almost universally hated. He says it kills the battery of your car without any significant benefit to the environment. And 60% of Americans driving new vehicles just heard the government validate every single frustration they've screamed at their dashboard for the last decade. Here's the thing, though. That announcement wasn't really about start-stop. It was the opening act for the single largest deregulatory action in American history. And what nobody is telling you, what the press conference carefully avoided, what the automakers celebrating this decision are praying you never think about, is what actually disappears when the credits go away, and who ends up paying for it. Because it's not who you think. I need to be honest with you before we go any further. For years, I defended start-stop technology. I told people the restarts were smooth, the fuel savings were real, the engineering was sound. I parroted the talking points because I believed in the underlying science, and I dismissed the complaints as people being dramatic about a minor inconvenience. Then I drove a rental with a cheap start-stop system through Houston traffic for 4 days. The shuddering, the half-second hesitation when you need to merge, the battery warning light on a 2-year-old vehicle. I sat at a red light, felt the engine die for the 40th time that day, and thought, maybe I've been defending the brochure instead of the experience. So today we're going to pull this thing apart, both sides. The people who hated this technology, the people who designed it, the politicians who just killed it, and the exposed truth about who actually benefits from all of this. Because I promise you, it's not working families, and it's not the environment. It's something far more cynical. If you spent any time on automotive forums between 2012 and 2025, you saw the war. One side was loud, personal, and furious. Drivers flooding service departments and Reddit threads with the same complaints repeated thousands of times. The engine shuts off at a red light, and the restart shakes the whole cabin. My battery died at 28,000 miles, and the dealer says it's not covered. I have to press a button to disable it every single time I start my car, every single trip, like some kind of punishment for buying a new vehicle. These weren't fringe complaints, they were mainstream. Consumer surveys consistently showed start-stop as one of the most disliked features in modern automobiles. People felt like the technology was imposed on them, a solution to a problem they didn't ask to solve, shoved into their daily commute by regulators who would never sit in traffic in a base model Chevy. But the other side had data. Engineers and environmental advocates pointed to real-world testing from Consumer Reports showing 7 to 15% fuel economy improvements in city driving. They pointed to the global adoption of the technology, standard equipment on virtually every new car sold in Europe and Asia. They cited studies showing that modern absorbent glass mat batteries and enhanced starter motors were specifically designed for the duty cycle, that premature failures were largely a myth confined to early implementations and budget systems. They argued that hating start-stop was like hating seatbelts in 1968, uncomfortable at first, universally accepted later, a technology that saves resources whether you personally feel good about it or not. Both camps believed they were right. Both camps had evidence, and both camps were completely missing the actual story because this was never really about whether a feature works or doesn't work. It was about who gets to use your frustration as a political weapon and who profits on the other side. To understand what actually happened on February 13th, you need to go back to 2012. President Obama's EPA finalized greenhouse gas emission standards for vehicles, and buried inside those regulations was something called off-cycle credits. The concept was simple. If automakers installed technologies that reduced real-world emissions but didn't show up on standard laboratory tests, they could earn credits toward their compliance targets. Start-stop qualified. An engine that shuts off at idle burns zero fuel at idle. On paper, the math was elegant. In practice, it created a loophole the size of a freeway. Automakers realized they could bolt a start-stop system onto an existing engine, earn enough credits to meet federal standards, and avoid spending billions on fundamental powertrain redesign. The technology cost roughly $300 to $500 per vehicle to implement. The compliance credits it generated were worth far more than that. By 2025, approximately 60% of new vehicles shipped with start-stop as standard equipment. Not because consumers demanded it, not because it was the best engineering solution, because it was the cheapest way to check a regulatory box. That's not innovation. That's a compliance shortcut wearing an engineering costume. Here's where the economics get interesting, because the frustration you felt every time your engine shuddered back to life at a green light was by design, just not the design anyone admits to. Automakers had a choice. They could invest in smooth, seamless start-stop systems with premium components, proper calibration, and noise vibration, harshness engineering that made the transitions invisible. Or they could install the cheapest possible system that technically qualified for the credits. Guess which option won on most vehicles? Premium brands like BMW and Mercedes spent the money. Their systems were nearly imperceptible. But volume manufacturers, the ones building the cars most Americans actually buy, often implemented the bare minimum. Rough restarts, noticeable vibration, delayed throttle response. The consumer complaints were real, but they weren't an indictment of the technology. They were an indictment of how cheaply it was implemented when the only goal was regulatory compliance rather than customer satisfaction. The automakers created the problem, customers blamed the regulation, and politicians used that blame as ammunition. Everybody played their role perfectly. That brings us to the money, because the Trump administration claimed eliminating start-stop credits would save consumers $2,400 per vehicle and $1.3 trillion total. Those numbers sound massive. They sound like liberation. They also collapse under about 30 seconds of scrutiny. The $2,400 figure doesn't represent the cost of start-stop systems. Remember, those add $300 to $500 to production costs. The $2,400 includes avoided compliance costs across every regulation being eliminated in the package. The entire deregulatory action, not just this one feature. It's like claiming you saved $1,000 on groceries this month when really you canceled your health insurance, your gym membership, and your kids' piano lessons, then counted the total. The number is technically accurate and fundamentally misleading. Meanwhile, the administration pointed to average new vehicle prices approaching $50,000, up 43% from a decade earlier, and blamed emissions regulations. But independent analysis from Cox Automotive showed that the price increases were driven primarily by consumer preference for larger trucks and SUVs, increased technology content that buyers actually wanted, supply chain disruptions, and dealer markups. Emissions compliance was a factor, but framing it as the primary driver of unaffordability was like blaming the parsley for the cost of your steak dinner. But here's what I need you to understand, because this is where it stops being about a car feature and starts being about how you think. The start-stop announcement was the appetizer. The main course served the same day was the complete repeal of the 2009 greenhouse gas endangerment finding. That finding, established under the Clean Air Act, was the legal foundation for regulating carbon dioxide emissions from vehicles, power plants, and industrial sources. Every federal climate regulation for the past 17 years rested on that single legal determination. Repealing it didn't just kill start-stop credits. It eliminated Biden-era electric vehicle incentives. It revoked California's emissions waiver, the one that allowed the state and 14 others to set their own standards. It gutted fuel economy requirements through model year 2027. The entire regulatory framework for addressing transportation emissions, the single largest source of greenhouse gases in the United States, was dismantled in one afternoon. And the headline everyone shared, the story that went viral, the thing people actually talked about, was that annoying feature that turns your engine off at red lights. You were given the appetizer to be outraged about while the main course was served to someone else entirely. That's you. Right now. If you celebrated this announcement because you hate start-stop, you celebrated the demolition of an entire regulatory structure because they packaged it with the one thing guaranteed to get your emotional buy-in. Ford and Stellantis publicly supported the deregulation. Of course they did. They just got freed from billions in compliance costs. They're not passing those savings to you. They're passing them to shareholders. You're the volunteer spokesperson for their lobbying win, and you're doing it for free because your engine used to shudder at red lights. I talked to an automotive engineer last month. I'm going to call him Marcus because he still works in the industry, and what he told me would end his career. Marcus spent 6 years developing start-stop calibration software for a major American automaker. He said his team knew exactly how to make the system seamless. They had the engineering. They had tested prototypes that restarted so smoothly you couldn't tell the engine had stopped. Management rejected the premium components 3 times. The directive from above was clear: meet the credit threshold at minimum cost. Marcus watched his elegant engineering get stripped down to the cheapest possible implementation, then watched consumers blame the technology instead of the bean counters who gutted it. When the 2026 announcement came, Marcus said something that hasn't left me. He said, "I spent 6 years building something that could have worked beautifully, watched my company deliberately make it worse to save $11 per unit, then watched the government kill the whole concept because consumers hated the version my company chose to build. And the company that ruined it is now celebrating that it's dead." He paused. Then he said, "The drivers were right to hate it, but they were hating the wrong thing." Nobody attacked him for saying that because he can't say it publicly. The people who can say it, the engineers who've left the industry, post anonymously because the last one who spoke openly got blacklisted from 3 manufacturers. In 2026 America, telling the truth about automotive engineering is a career-ending move. The real cost of this story isn't $300 for a start-stop system or $2,400 in phantom savings. It's the precedent. Without the endangerment finding, there is no legal basis for federal vehicle emission standards. The same vehicles sold in Munich with start-stop particulate filters and advanced emissions controls will be sold in Michigan without them, not because Americans don't deserve clean air, but because the regulatory framework that required it no longer exists. Environmental groups point out that transportation generates the largest share of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. Scientists warn that removing proven emissions reduction technologies while global temperatures continue rising is, to use their word, catastrophic. But those warnings land in a political environment where engineering reality has become a partisan position, where pointing out that start-stop actually saves fuel in city driving makes you a climate activist, and where the math on grid capacity or atmospheric carbon is dismissed as ideology rather than physics. We've trained ourselves to evaluate technology based on which political team endorses it rather than whether it works. And that training doesn't go away when the next technology debate arrives. It just transfers to electric vehicles, to autonomous driving, to whatever comes next. That start-stop system you hated, the one that shuttered your engine at every red light, it's going to disappear from American cars within 2 to 3 model years. And the $300 to $500 it costs to build will not come off your sticker price. The automakers will pocket it. The fuel savings you would have gotten in city driving, 7 to 15%, gone. The emissions reductions from millions of vehicles idling less, gone. The regulatory framework that required anyone to care about what comes out of your tailpipe, gone. All of it traded for the satisfaction of never feeling that engine shudder again. I've watched families argue about this at Thanksgiving. I've seen engineers go quiet at dinner parties when someone celebrates the announcement, knowing they can't explain the full picture without being labeled political. I've watched online communities split into camps that can't hear each other anymore, defending positions handed to them by institutions that don't care about them at all. The real damage isn't the policy. Policies change. Administrations change. The real damage is teaching 70 million car owners that their frustration with a poorly implemented feature is more important than understanding why it was implemented poorly in the first place. That lesson sticks. That lesson shapes how you evaluate every piece of technology, every regulation, every political promise for the rest of your life. So tell me, do you support killing start-stop, or do you think it should have stayed? I don't actually care about your answer. What I care about is this. Can you name one legitimate point the other side makes? If you hated start-stop, can you admit it reduced emissions in city driving? If you supported it, can you admit the consumer experience was often genuinely terrible? If you can't do that, if acknowledging a single valid point from the other side feels like losing, then congratulations. You're not evaluating technology. You're defending an identity that was manufactured for you by people who are already counting the money.